The U.S. government opened, read, and burned 6 million letters every single year, and it was completely legal. Somewhere in a government warehouse in 1885, a woman named Clara Richter held an envelope addressed only to "My son. He lives out west. He drives a red ox. The railroad goes by there." No city, no street, just a mother's desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would find her boy. Clara solved that puzzle. She solved thousands like them. She was so proud of her work that she kept a personal scrapbook, carefully mounting each decoded envelope, writing the correct address on the back like the answer to a riddle. And then, as the law required, she burned everything else she touched. 6 million letters a year. That was the number Patty Collins gave in 1899 when the Ladies' Home Journal asked her why so much American mail simply disappeared. Collins ran the dead letter office in Washington, and she had seen it all. Letters sent to asylums that had shut down, letters to orphanages that had relocated, letters to immigrants scattered across a continent that kept no record of its own people. Every single one was opened, read just enough to search for a clue, and then, if it could not be delivered or returned, destroyed. Not lost, not misfiled, destroyed by policy, burned by the cartload, pulped into paper, erased from existence. When I went looking for the records of this office, for the archive that should document a century of American communication failures, I found something that stopped me cold. One box. According to the National Archives finding aids, only one box of dead letter office operational records survives. Miscellaneous records, 1897 through 1930. That is what remains of a century of work, millions upon millions of letters passing through federal hands. One box. I came to this sideways. I was researching the 1890 census fire, following the pattern of government archives that seemed to vanish at convenient moments, when I noticed something I had missed before. The fire that destroyed most of the 1890 census happened in January 1921 in the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington. But the post office had occupied that same building for years, and across the hall from where census records burned, another kind of destruction had been happening quietly for nearly a century, not by fire, by law. The Dead Letter Office was established in 1825 to handle mail that could not be delivered. By 1882, clerks were processing 13,600 pieces of undeliverable mail every single day. By 1893, that number had climbed to over 20,000 daily. By the early 1900s, 30,000 pieces arrived each day, 11 million items per year, and among those, 80,000 letters annually had no address whatsoever. Someone had written words meant for another human being and simply sent them into the void, hoping. The clerks who worked there were remarkable. When the Civil War pulled men away to fight, the post office turned to women to handle the mounting chaos of undeliverable mail. By 1865, 38 women worked in the dead letter office against only 7 men. Administrators quickly discovered that women were patient, meticulous, and extraordinarily skilled at what the office called blind reading, the art of deciphering impossible addresses. A letter addressed simply to Ireland. Collins knew instantly there was a region of West Virginia called the Island. A letter to the largest dealer in old medical books in Boston. A letter to the only President Street in America, which happened to be in Baltimore. These women memorized street names across the entire country. They learned the phonetic patterns of immigrants who had never written a letter before. They studied handwriting from every region of Europe. Collins herself was fluent in French, German, Greek, and Arabic.
Clara Richter, the German immigrant who kept those scrapbooks, eventually rose to become chief of the Foreign Mail Division. They were documentation machines, each processing 1,000 letters a day, and they were paid $600 a year, while men doing identical work earned $900. Now, you might say the destruction was necessary, privacy protection. The government couldn't keep millions of private letters forever. People have a right to have their failed communications destroyed rather than stored in some archive for historians to dig through a century later. That is a reasonable argument. I considered it carefully. But here is what troubles me. They kept the curiosities. By the 1870s, the Dead Letter Office established a museum that became one of Washington's most popular tourist attractions. They displayed the rattlesnakes that arrived alive in a perforated tin can in 1903. They kept the human skulls, the wedding cakes, the false teeth. One visitor actually recognized and reclaimed his own lost dentures while wandering the exhibits. They kept a lock of hair from Charles Guiteau, the man who assassinated Garfield, mailed to some unknown admirer. They kept a blood-soaked mailbag from a carrier attack in the Southwest. They kept the objects interesting enough to draw crowds. What they burned were the letters themselves, the human connection, the words. The most haunting items in that museum were not the curiosities. They were the Civil War soldier photographs. During the war, thousands of young men sent portraits home to their families, small carte de visite and tintypes tucked inside letters. But many of these soldiers had little education. They had never addressed an envelope before. The addresses were illegible, incomplete, wrong. By the end of the war, the Dead Letter Office held 4.5 million undelivered letters and thousands of unclaimed soldier photographs. Estimates ranged from 5,000 to 15,000 images. Third Assistant Postmaster General Alexander Zevelin had an idea. He mounted the photographs on panels in groups of 36, numbered them in red ink, and put them on public display. Crowdsourcing before the word existed. Families would come searching for the faces of fathers, husbands, brothers lost to the war. Women wept as they scanned the panels. Sometimes they found who they were looking for. On June 17, 1874, a man claimed the photograph of Lieutenant S. Roderick of the 19th Iowa Infantry. On October 16, 1902, Edward Marsh of the 10th New York Battery claimed a photograph of himself 40 years after he had mailed it. 40 years. Estimates suggest around 2,000 such reunions occurred, but thousands more photographs remained unclaimed, a silent memorial to the war's dead, until 1911, when the museum closed and the album was divided and sold.
I keep returning to that mother writing to her son who drove a red ox. Clara Richter solved that puzzle. She was proud enough to save the envelope in her scrapbook, but the letter inside, the words that mother chose, what she needed him to know, those were burned with the rest. Her blind reading scrapbooks survive at the Smithsonian today because she wanted to remember her triumphs. 21 envelopes, postmarked 1883 through 1884, marked illegibly addressed, misdirected, no such office in state named, with the solutions written on the back. That is what remains of 30 years of work. Not the letters, not the words, just the puzzles she solved. Maybe that is fine. Maybe some things should not be preserved. But then I think about what was actually passing through that office, not just badly addressed mail from careless senders, letters to the institutions of 19th century America. I found one surviving envelope that tells its own story. It bears markings in pencil and multiple colors of ink, not at Blackwell's Island, not at Randall's Island, not at Insane Ward's Island, not at Almshouse, not at Infants RIH, not at RI Hospital, not an insane asylum. In 1890, Blackwell's Island alone, now called Roosevelt Island, held the first municipal mental hospital in the country, plus an almshouse and a prison. 5,047 patients in institutions on those islands. Someone was trying to reach a person who had been committed. The letter bounced from asylum to asylum, hospital to hospital, and eventually landed in the dead letter office. What happened to it then? Burned, as the law required. What would we understand about American institutional life if those letters had survived? How many mothers wrote to children in orphanages who never received their words? How many patients in asylums had letters arrive marked "No such person at this address"? How many inheritance claims failed to reach families who had already scattered? How many death notices arrived too late at doors already standing empty? The dead letter office was not simply processing mail with bad handwriting. It was documenting the chaos of American expansion, American institutions, American families torn apart by war and migration and poverty, and then, by law, it erased the evidence. Herman Melville understood this in 1853, just 28 years after the office was established. His story, Bartleby the Scrivener, ends with a rumor that before Bartleby became a copyist, he had worked at the dead letter office, sorting letters for the flames. "Dead letters," Melville wrote. "Does it not sound like dead men? A ring pulled from folded paper, the finger it was meant for, perhaps already in the grave. A banknote sent in charity to someone who no longer hungers. Pardon for those who died despairing. Hope for those who died unhoping." He saw it. A canonical American author, writing in 1853, understood that burning those letters meant burning evidence of lives that could not connect, words that arrived too late, hope sent to the wrong address. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. 1896, fire destroys special schedules from the 1890 census. 1811, the Dead Letter Office Museum closes, contents transferred to the Smithsonian, then scattered across multiple institutions, some of it deaccessioned, which is the polite museum word for discarded. 1921, fire in the Commerce Department destroys most of the 1890 census records that survived the first fire. 1933, Congress authorizes destruction of whatever remained. Same building, same decades, same result. Archives that do not exist. One researcher describes going to the National Archives looking for dead letter office records and being handed a box labeled 1830 through 1876 that was not even in the finding aids. Inside were 4 letters from 1889 that should have been destroyed, misfiled, and forgotten. The only letters in an otherwise administrative archive. Their presence was evidence that the information system had failed at every point, she wrote. In the aborted transit of the letters, their survival inside an office committed to their destruction, and the absence of those archives from the public record meant to guarantee their preservation. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. Maybe the systematic destruction of dead letters was simply good policy, protecting privacy in an era before privacy law. Maybe the loss of the museum was just institutional reorganization. Maybe the one surviving box is genuinely all that was worth keeping. Maybe the connection to the 1890 census is coincidence, 2 archives in the same building meeting similar fates for entirely different reasons. But I cannot stop thinking about those letters to the asylums, about the mothers writing to sons who drove red oxen, about 11 million pieces of mail passing through federal hands, opened, read, and burned without record. We know the dead letter office existed. We know what passed through it. We know what they did with it.
The blind reading scrapbooks survived because Clara Richter was proud of her puzzle solving. The Civil War soldier photographs survived because they were too emotional to destroy. The rattlesnakes survived because someone found them interesting. But the letters? The 6 million letters that went astray every year, the words of mothers and soldiers and immigrants and dying men, those were destroyed as the law required. Without record, without archive, without trace. What do we lose when we systematically destroy the failures of a system? The letters that did not arrive tell us something the delivered letters never can. They tell us who was unreachable, who had vanished, who had been committed, who had died, who had moved without leaving a forwarding address because they were running from something or someone. The dead letter office was not simply postal curiosity. It was a map of American disconnection, rendered in 6 million data points per year, and then burned. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. A government office documenting who could not be found in America, and then destroying that documentation by law for a century. The buildings remember, even if the archives do not. One box survives. Miscellaneous records 1897 through 1930. Somewhere in that box, or somewhere in what was burned, there might be an answer to a question you did not know you had. A letter to a great-grandmother in an asylum, a death notice that never reached your family, an inheritance claim that failed because someone had already moved on. You will never know. The dead letter office made sure of that. Not through conspiracy, not through a cover-up, through policy, through law, through the quiet, methodical destruction of everything it touched. What else vanished the same way? What other archives do not exist because someone decided a century ago that certain questions were not worth preserving? I do not know, but I keep looking. And the more I look, the more I find the same 3 words at the end of every trail. Acknowledge, categorize, destroy.